Good evening. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Karen Cloyd, and I currently serve as the chair of the Campaign for Common Sense Gun Solutions Committee of Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. We are here tonight to remember those whose lives were lost to gun violence, and especially to honor the children our community lost to gun violence. According to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, as of December 7th, 66 area children were injured or killed by firearm injuries. 20 died as the result of their injuries. And equally important, this is a very important date in history for those of us who are battling gun violence and trying to keep children safer, because 11 years ago today, 20 first graders and 6 educators were killed by a young man that should not have had access to a firearm. My Facebook memory reminded me that those children should be driving by now. It's been that long, they should all be licensed drivers. If you would, please join me in a moment of silence to remember those children and all affected by gun violence. Okay, thank you. Our program tonight is titled Red Flag Laws and Other Sensible Solutions to Curb Gun Violence. Again, the postcards in the back, you may, we're starting an initiative with a fellow group battling for children's gun storage safety issues in Kansas City, and we kind of adopted their postcards. So if you would like to, we'll focus next time on state officials, but there is actually legislation being introduced in the Senate and in the House to work towards safe gun storage practices, to make them, commonplace, standard, mandatory. One of which, if you have time, you might want to look up Go Safe Act. It is sponsored by 4 senators, one of whom is an independent, so they're touting it as bipartisan. I know, but you might want to look into that. I need more firearm knowledge before I can understand what that one is actually talking about. And it's called the Go Safe Act. We are grateful to our speakers for joining us tonight. They're very accomplished. Our first speaker will be Jessica Woolbright, who is Executive Director of St. Martha's Hall. She has been serving women and children impacted by domestic violence since 2000. For over 20 years, she served as a children's program director at St. Martha's, and was promoted to Executive Director in January of 2020. She is only the second person to be named ED of that organization in 4 decades. In 2021, she developed a drop-in center model for St. Martha's that expanded the organization's services. Woolbright has been qualified as an expert witness in the prosecution of domestic violence cases in several Missouri circuit courts. She offers over 100 presentations annually. Woolbright was awarded the National Network to End Domestic Violence Lifetime Achievement Award in 2021. Very important word. Our second speaker this evening is Michael A. Wolf. He currently works as a mediator and settlement administrator. He consults on cases, legal ethics matters, and criminal justice reform, and teaches occasionally at St. Louis University. Wolf was on the faculty of the St. Louis SLU Law School for 23 years until his appointment to the Supreme Court of Missouri in 1998. In that period, he served 2 years as transition director and chief counsel to Missouri Governor Mel Carnahan while on leave from the university, and special counsel for 4 years until his judicial appointment. He also served as the first chair of the Missouri Consolidated Healthcare Plan for state employees from 1993 to 1998. Wolf also served on the Supreme Court of Missouri until 2011, including 2 years as Chief Justice from 2005 to 2007. He returned to the St. Louis University faculty in 2011 and became Dean of the Law School in 2013, serving until 2017. Wolf has been active in the American Law Institute, serving as an advisor on the Model Penal Code Sentencing Project. He has served on the board of the National Courts and Science Institute, which provides science education to judges. He was senior advisor and transition director for St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney Wesley Bell after the 2018 election until January 2020. And we are going to hear from Jessica Woolbright first, I believe. The microphone is yours.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here this evening. I don't think that there is anything that I believe in more strongly than the power of women, especially when they have a common purpose. So that is exactly why I'm here tonight, because of all of those women in my life that came before me, that gave me the opportunity to do this work and to learn from some of the most wonderful women. So thank you for having me here. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about me personally before I get into the work. So yes, I have been with St. Martha's for 23 years. And I like to say that I got into social work so I could rebel against my conservative parents. But they're very proud of the work that I do. My experience with guns, it might be a little bit different. So I grew up in a household where there were guns, and it was not uncommon. My dad, my entire life growing up, was a state trooper. I remember my husband loves to tell the story of when he picked me up for our first date. My dad had just gotten home from a SWAT call, and the entire SWAT team was in our living room. So he quickly was introduced to firearms as well. My husband did not grow up with guns, wanted nothing to do with them. So it was sort of my dad's, mission to take him to the gun range and see what could happen. So I tell you that just to say that I am not against all guns, right? My dad had guns. We grew up with guns. We absolutely were taught gun safety. My dad believed in a person's right to carry a gun and to have a gun. And he believed that with that privilege came a lot of responsibility. And he would be the first one to tell you that, yes, you have a right to a gun, but the minute you put it up against your wife's head or you threaten your child with it, that you have just given up that privilege. So that is how I have always been able to balance the work. I cannot talk about domestic violence without talking about guns, unfortunately. And they've always been there. The threat has always been there, but it is getting worse. So St. Martha's has been open for over 40 years. We had the shelter. 2 years ago, as was mentioned, we opened the drop-in center. And the drop-in center was a place for women who were in a violent relationship, but maybe didn't need that shelter piece. So research tells us that on the high end, 10% of women who are in violent relationships will ever seek shelter. So while the shelter is very, very important, there was a lot of women that we were not reaching. So we wanted to find a way to offer those services, the safety planning, the legal advocacy, support groups, but for women who didn't need shelter. So the drop-in center evolved. Some of you, I know for sure one of you, knew Sister Jean Moyer and Sister Irma Kennebeck, who opened the first women's place, or the first drop-in center in Maplewood several years ago. And then as the nuns got older, sort of had to take that ministry and give it to somebody else. St. Martha's never really believed that their drop-in center model was ever the same when the nuns left. So we had been talking for years about how we can have that model again. Then COVID happened, and it highlighted the need to be able to serve women in a different way. So we have Sister Irma and Sister Jean's picture in the building to remind us, even though I know that they're with us in a lot of ways, like I can hear them in my head all the time about the way we should do things. But at that drop-in center, we have a memorial garden planted in the front. And when we first moved in, the idea was that this memorial garden would honor the lives of women and children, not only women and children, but that's overwhelmingly the majority of the victims that we see. And we had no idea how many names would end up in that garden. So we have been open for 2 years, and there are 47 names in that garden. Now, not all of those are from the past 2 years, but most of them are. Out of those 47 names, 65% of those people were murdered with a firearm. That's why I cannot talk about domestic violence without talking about gun violence. So women and children. So women have flowers, children have butterflies, sort of a metal flower, metal butterfly with their name engraved. But we also have the names of brothers who intervened and tried to protect their sister and were murdered. We have a sister whose flower is right next to her sister's name. So 2 sisters together. One was in the violent relationship. The other came in from Colorado to help her sister move, and he murdered both of them. And we have children. And again, all of these were firearms. So the crisis of domestic violence is very closely linked to both the widespread and the growing use of guns by abusers. It is a really powerful way to maintain that power control, just the firearm being in the house. And it is not uncommon for those threats to escalate to murder. So we live in a very violent society. I mean, we opened with a moment of silence about first graders who were murdered. And there is one thing that I know for certain, that we are never going to end violence in schools. We are never going to end violence in the neighborhoods until we end violence in our homes, because that's where it starts. That is the first place that children learn that violence is acceptable. I don't know how many of you saw the breaking news story earlier this week. I think it was Tuesday morning, that a 12-year-old intervened to protect his mom. So his mom was being abused. He went and got a shotgun and shot the boyfriend in the head. The boyfriend survived, at last I've heard, but that 12-year-old has now been charged with first-degree assault. So to say that this is a women's issue, or to say that this is just a domestic violence issue, completely minimizes the ripple effect that guns in the hands of abusers or in the homes of the abuser extends way past that intimate relationship, because it affects the children, and it affects family members, it affects coworkers. So these are the people that are also calling our drop-in center, and they're saying, somebody I work with is in this relationship, or somebody in my parish has expressed this concern. This has an impact on everybody. This has an impact on law enforcement officers who have to respond. I can remember my dad telling me, as we would, talk shop, that police officers hate domestic violence calls for a variety of reasons, but for one of them being that it is one of the most dangerous calls that they will ever have to respond to, right? And I acknowledge that. I am not minimizing that. But they go in with a gun and a bulletproof vest. She doesn't. And the kids don't. The deadly intersection of guns and domestic violence has a disproportionate impact on women of color, American Indian or Alaska Native, and Latina women. Access to a gun, so meaning there's a gun in the home, makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will die at the hands of her domestic abuser. So just the presence of a gun in the home. We hear a lot about mass shootings. What do we typically hear about after mass shootings? What do people want to talk about? They want to talk about gun control. They want to talk about mental health issues. How often do you hear people talk about domestic violence after a mass shooting? Very rarely, right? You typically what you're going to hear is you're going to read a paragraph that says, nobody saw this coming. There was no warning signs, and he had no criminal history. And then you read on to the next paragraph. And in the next paragraph, it says, the wife that he recently separated from, or the girlfriend that recently left, filed an order of protection and alleged domestic violence, as if domestic violence is not a criminal history, right? So in domestic violence cases, we tend to hold the abuser, the perpetrator, to a much lower standard than we would hold the perpetrator of any abuse that happened on the street. When in reality, we should be able to hold that person to a much higher standard. So mass shootings, over 56% of mass shootings started because the perpetrator was targeting an intimate partner or a family member. And we don't hear about that when we hear about mass shootings, right? We hear about the gun control, we hear mental health. We are not looking at that connection to domestic violence. In the United States, 2/3 of women that are killed by an intimate partner are killed with a gun. And the existing loopholes in federal and state laws allow access to guns by abusive partners or sometimes stalkers. And research clearly shows that federal and state policies that disrupt access to a gun can save lives. In our very own state of Missouri, so the research on this is about 2 years behind. 67 females were murdered by men in Missouri in the year 2020. We rank 6th in the nation in the number of women murdered by men in intimate relationships. So this is not random violence. This is in their home. Missouri has always been in the top 10 of that research. They've been doing it for 25 years. And there is a strong connection. Those top 10 states never change. The order might change. We've gone from 2nd to tied for 7th to 6th. But those top 10 states always stay the same. And the one thing that they have in common is their gun laws. For homicides in which the weapon could be identified, 78% of the victims were shot and killed with guns. When I was doing some of my research tonight and putting my notes together, I kept going back and forth and saying, do I want to say killed by a gun, or do I want to say killed by a person who had a gun? Because we always hear guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? But what I kept coming back to is that it's people with access to guns that kill people. It's both. And it's the second isn't even close. So 78% were shot and killed. The next closest percentage was 4% was a knife. So it's not even close. So you cannot tell me that it's not the gun. It's not people with access to guns that are causing the most harm. So what can we do about it? Probably like most of you in the room, we are patiently awaiting the United States Supreme Court ruling on Rahimi. I go back and forth if I'm optimistic or cynical. It's really scary to be optimistic. So St. Martha's is part of the Catholic Charities Federation. So one thing that we have been doing for the last year, we have looked at gun laws in all the 50 states. And we are starting with some really low hanging fruit. So what we are looking at, and because of the connection to domestic violence, is how can we propose or advocate for legislation that simply says, it's not so simple, I like to say simply, but basically says that people with a full order of protection against them will not have access to a firearm. All we're asking just to match the federal law. So we looked at all the other states. We looked at states that look very much like Missouri, very red, very conservative. And those laws are already on the books in other states. So Kentucky has this law, Tennessee has this law, Alabama has this law. So we want to be able to take it to legislators in Jeff City and just show we're not asking you to do anything that your brothers and sisters have not done. But we're slowing down a little bit because we want to see what that Supreme Court case. I mean, that could, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but it'll help. And the Archdiocese of St. Louis has very recently, after a gun violence summit this summer, the Archbishop has appointed a task force that Kathy is also on. I am really excited to see if putting the full weight of the Catholic Church behind the gun violence problem, I think we have a chance. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. But to me, what it comes down to is that same thought that my dad had about guns, that with great power comes great responsibility. So let's see what we can do with that responsibility. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I can get on a soapbox and talk much longer, but I will hand it over to Judge Wolf.
Really nice to be with you. I was reflecting when you started talking about growing up with guns. I needed to tell you that I'm a graduate of the NRA Rifle Safety Clinic.
All right.
12 years old. And I had a shotgun, I had a 22 caliber rifle, and I had a BB gun. So, I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, you know, that was, we had, but it was an interesting time because I followed the NRA over the years. They were the hunters, and they were conservationists. And something happened in our country, because, and by the way, I might also say that there are other countries that they don't have as many guns as we do, but they have a lot of guns. Canada has a lot of guns. The Scandinavian countries have a lot of guns. Germans, for God's sake, have a lot of guns. They don't shoot each other as much as we do. We shoot each other a lot. And so the question is, well, what is it about our culture? And I think, and I reflected on this because there has been, and I don't, the kind of mass shootings does involve access to weapons that fire very rapidly. We didn't have those back then. We had take one shot at a time. So, but the other thing that we've come to, and so we have to start with the idea that our country started with one of the original the Bill of Rights, Second Amendment. Second Amendment is very simple. We don't know what it means really, but but it's very simple. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. I've spoken on this, well, maybe longer than it was 35 years ago. It always seemed to me that as a matter of text, you could read that either way. And it was logical to read it to say that it protected individual rights, because of the right of the people is also referred to in the First Amendment about the right to free speech. That is the right of the people. So, so I'm not going to argue about what that means. The Supreme Court did that to us in 2008 and said, yes, it does protect the right of individuals to keep and bear arms. But they went on to say there are some regulations, reasonable regulations that can be applied. And that's really where we are now. When you talk about red flag laws, when you talk about background checks and things like that, we don't have any of that in Missouri. Okay. And so let me back up and say, well, where did this all come from? in the 1990-ish area, when the NRA was still at mostly a bunch of hunters, we had gone through a period starting in the 60s where people were very concerned about disruption, crime. People ran, I remember the 1968 campaign, many of you remember, some of you remember it, I won't say which ones. I do. Law and order, right? Well, then they weren't sure whether the government would protect us, so therefore you should protect yourself. And what happened, I think, with the National Rifle Association, and it is not the only organization, there is a proliferation of people, of organizations that promote gun ownership and so forth. Most of them are majorly funded by people who manufacture guns. After all, why wouldn't they? They're in the business of making and selling guns. They're in the business of making and selling ammunition. Why the hell wouldn't they? Say that everybody who wants one should have one. In fact, you should have 4. I only have 3. So the Bill of Rights, which came into the Constitution in 1791, 2 years after our constitutional document was ratified, has what I just read. And until fairly recent decades, I'd say in the 1980s is when this agitation started. And I think it was a result of people's concerns about crimes and protection and all that kind of stuff. In fact, I think in the 1930s, the NRA was actually in favor of it, a measure that controlled what we call then machine guns. They didn't think that fast repeating weapons were necessary to the protection of whatever individual rights they have. I always liked, by the way, that thing about the answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, I wasn't much of a hunter. I have to tell you that in all the things of shooting of things, I never killed anything. I was a bad shot. Then I realized that that's rather common. And I was making a comment about how people in the heat of a stressful situation aren't very good at firing their weapons. And I was on a panel with a guy who had been on the police board in the city, and they investigated an incident where a police officer who's trained in the use of his weapon fired 5 times at a car at point blank range. All 5 shots missed. That's what happens when you're under stress. You might hit something else, might hit somebody else. But in that case, thankfully, nobody else got hit. Probably some random buildings. So I think that we can't discount how we don't trust each other by such things as race and ethnicity and class. Factor that in. So we did have a crime problem that was developing, and also a gun problem that was developing. And in the 1990s, we put severe restrictions on what we call assault weapons, however we define that. But basically, rapidly repeating things, good for killing lots of things in a few seconds. That went into effect in the Clinton administration. It had a 10-year sunset clause, so it went out of effect 10 years later, unless the Congress renewed it. Well, by 10 years later, we were in the Bush administration, the Republican Congress. And that's when there was a major increase in the number of what we call mass shootings. I think mass is still defined as 4 or more deaths in an individual incident. And by the way, it doesn't escape my notice that how many of those shooters are women?
Yes.
Okay. And how many of them were pissed off men? 99.4%. I don't know, I just made that up. I'm close. In 2008, as I said, the Supreme Court of the United States in 2 cases decided that the individual right applied. And then they did nothing. They were silent on this, and people developed proposals for various kinds of things that you've seen in other states. for regulating guns. In our state, it was unlawful to carry a concealed weapon. And the legislature was agitating. This is, by the way, the Democrats controlled the legislature in Missouri in the 1990s, and the 2000s, the Republicans took over. I want to tell you that there's some differences. However, don't get too, if you're a Democratic persuasion, don't get too gloating about it. Because I remember when I came to Missouri, which was 45 years ago or so, 48 years ago, I got involved some years later in politics. When I met the Democrats from lots of different parts of Missouri, I realized what they were, because in Minnesota we called them Republicans. And then I realized, no, they weren't Republicans either. Confederates. The Democratic Party in much of rural Missouri were the remnants of the Confederacy. And then the Confederates eventually figured out that they were in the wrong party and they switched over. So the rest, as they say, is history. But so in 1998, when Governor Carnahan, my old boss, was governor, the legislature passed concealed law allowing concealed carry of weapons. But he told them that he was going to veto it. And he had enough votes to sustain his veto. So they passed it, and you can bypass the governor by referring it to people in a referendum. And in 1998, we voted. We voted about concealed carry. No. Well, 4 years later, when we voted, we got concealed carry, we got all kinds of stuff. First with permits, and now with none. We're the Wild West. Okay, let's just face it. There's the amount of gun regulation we have. There's some in the federal level, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in this period when the Supreme Court wasn't weighing in much about stuff, then along came a much more conservative majority in the court, and we got a couple of cases, and you mentioned one of them. The first of them was this New York Rifle Gun Club versus Bruin, a New York case, where Justice Thomas wrote for the majority that the Second Amendment covered, excluded regulation of guns that were not part of the historical tradition of firearms regulation. What does that do? That says we've got to go back and think about what was in the minds of people who were alive in 1791 to figure out what the hell this means, okay? Well, how many assault weapons were there in 1791? There weren't any, okay? But still, they're looking for them. But the other thing is that whenever you have a historical test, and many of you have read history and read a bit of history, it's kind of subject to whatever you think, okay? I can find you some gun regulations from 1790, and you can find me some stuff that says there wasn't any, okay? So then what do you do with that? Well, what I'm suggesting is that it is an inherently dishonest way of analyzing anything to think what was in the minds of these people in 1791 by way of history and all that kind of stuff. So the New York Rifle and Gun case, the Bruin case, struck down the regulation. It had been in New York law since 1911, and it required that you get a permit from your local sheriff in order to have a gun. I think it was a pistol, what the regulation was. But you could only get a permit if you could show the sheriff that you had proper cause to have a gun. And the Supreme Court said, no, that goes it up to arbitrary stuff. And actually, I have a bit of sympathy about that. I mean, in some smaller counties, the sheriff knows you. And if he doesn't like you, you say, nah, that's not cause. So it opened itself up. And so, but the main problem of Justice Thomas's opinion is that whole thing about historical tradition of firearms regulations. So here we go. So this, that was a couple months ago. The Supreme Court got a case called Rahimi And Rahimi was a guy who had been convicted of a domestic violence offense. And there's a federal statute that says that, or no, he was under an order of protection, sorry. There's a federal statute that says that it's unlawful, so it's a crime for him to have a weapon. And so he challenged this. There wasn't any such thing. But I have to tell you, the Clarence Thomas opinion was wildly overridden, because the lower federal courts and some of the state courts that have tried to figure out what Lewin really says are having a great deal of difficulty about what this historical reference is. But I think if when you look at what this guy Rahimi had on his record, it was really quite stunning. I have it here. He was between December 2020 and January 2021, Rahimi took part in 5 shootings. First, he shot at a man who purchased drugs from him after the man spoke disrespectfully to him. Rahimi fired into the man's house with an AR-15. By the way, that's a rapidly repeating assault. Second, the day after the prior shooting, Rahimi was involved in a traffic collision and fired at the other driver. Following this, he fled the scene of the crash, returned, fired more shots at the other driver, then fled again. 3 days after the prior shooting, Rahimi fired a gun into the air while in the presence of children. Fourth, some weeks after the prior incident, a truck on the highway flashed its headlights at Rahimi when he sped past the truck. Rahimi then followed the truck off the highway and fired shots at another car that had been following the truck. And fifth, Rahimi fired a gun into the air at a fast food restaurant after a friend's credit card was declined. This guy is the kind of guy you'd like to have put a weapon in that man's hands. So he's in the Supreme, this lawyer's in the Supreme Court telling the justices that their opinion in Bruin protects his right to have a gun. That is about as absurd as it gets. Okay, I have to say, I think if they don't walk this analysis back a bit and give us a little breathing room, that we got to do something to replace the Supreme Court. I'm not sure. So I got some other issues. This year, I've involved with one group. There's a group that called itself Sensible Missouri that I helped out, and they were, and here's what the proposition was: it's hopeless to go to the Missouri legislature. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of the NRA and the rifle manufacturers. Okay, just forget that. But Judge Jimmy Edwards and former Mayor Shamel and former Senator Joan Gray, everybody's a former Professor Emeritus Roosevelt, called an organization called Sensible Missouri. And I helped them with this because what I thought was saleable was that you have a ballot proposition to ask the voters to allow St. Louis County, Kansas City, Jackson County to have local regulations that would, and because the rest of the states, I mean, there are some urban areas outside of the ones I just mentioned, but by and large, rural people are what they are, and they're going to have guns. I mean, I had a cabin down on the Osage River when I was working in Jefferson City, and I had a guy come and pick up some stuff from me one time. I had an alarm there, and the alarm went off, and 3 of my neighbors blocked off the road, and among those 3 neighbors, they had 5 weapons. And when the guy showed up at my house with the stuff I needed to deliver in St. Louis, he said, actually, it's my cousin was the deputy sheriff who showed up. And he said, so I spread my hands over the hood of the car and all that dramatic stuff. Well, I found out what my neighbors had done. I said to this guy, Greg, your problem was not with the sheriff. My neighbors are ready to shoot you. Okay, so there's a good, self-help out there, including my neighbor who was a nice woman who was a nurse, but every once in a while she'd drink a little too much alcohol, and she decided it'd be fun to shoot across the river. So, you know, but she wasn't shooting at anybody, it was just woods over there. The only time you ever saw any activity over there was when you saw poachers. And then you call the sheriff. The proposition we have is a bunch of different versions of this, but essentially to allow the city and the county to do regulation on the local level. And then a number of us have been trying to interest the business community in this, because after all, it's a terrible blight on our reputation for business to have this wide open stuff. And you know, you can say the same thing about reproductive freedom and a whole lot of other dumb stuff that goes on. Okay, but this is one. And when we did this, we got kind of a pop-up group that had some, that said they had some serious money behind it, and they actually did some polling, and they came up with some propositions. One was a background check. This was statewide, not localized, but you can't do this unless you have a background, because it's a national instant background check system, which isn't too bad because it keeps track of not only felony counts, but also domestic violence orders and things like that. And it's very useful for if you're going to use it, have a permit system. And then you can get around the ruin case, but it's not going to be arbitrary. You either is or you isn't. It's not going to ask some sheriff to decide whether you are or you aren't. They had one proposition that was for background checks. They had another one that was for basically red flags, and I think they call that extreme risk protection orders. So if you're under a protection order, you couldn't do that. What happened was that the Secretary of State has to write the ballot language for the proposition. And the ballot language that he wrote was horrible. And then when that happens, you have to go to court. And courts have been fairly reasonable. I mean, I was involved in the litigation for the ballot title for the reproductive rights measure. That they just, it was, you know, they wrote it so that nobody could vote for it, right? And they did that for this. Well, by this time the time was running out. You know, you got to gather about 350,000 signatures. You need 171,000 to get enough signatures to get something on the ballot in 6 congressional districts, spread among 6 congressional districts. It takes about 350 signatures to get that many ballot ones, because they go through them and do it. And so they, even though they told us they had $20 million, they didn't want to spend it because it would be so late, they probably wouldn't be able to get on the ballot. But that's still going to be alive and well, I hope, in 2026. Because I think that's the only way that can be done. And they need to do it early so that when they get subjected to the ballot language, it's the Secretary of State. His name is Ashcroft. That's his son. He's the Secretary of State. They probably got the ballot language from an NRA lobbyist, but anyway, it was pretty terrible. You got to go to court. Court's been reasonable about this. They've done, by and large, the right thing. Occasionally they miss, but not very often. So that's where we are. There's other propositions around thinking about how to do local things. There is probably a narrow window for the county and or the city to, by ordinance, say that a child of 18, a person under 18 can't have a gun. Right now, there's no prohibition of that. If you're 14 years old and got an AR-15, feel free to walk down the street. People will get out of your way, by the way. But that's where we are. So I think you may have an opportunity to see that happening, either in the city or the county or both. There'd be separate measures to do that. But that's about as much latitude as the legislature left the localities, because what the legislature is fond of doing is saying, no, they're all about local stuff until you want to do something important. And it started, as many of you may remember, years ago when local communities started regulating or banning plastic bags in grocery stores. And then the legislature passed a statute that says communities can't regulate plastic bags. Well, now we're on, you can't regulate guns and you can't regulate this, that, or the other thing. So the fight goes on. It's a good fight. It may take longer than some of us are going to be alive, but hey, it's worth fighting. Keeps you alive, keeps you going. Anyway, thank you. It's nice to be here, and I think one of the questions is
So if I understand correctly, I just happened simply because of my job on this committee. I happen to have landed on that Sensible Missouri call, Zoom call. I'm sitting there going, okay. I'm sitting here with former Mayor Shamel and all these other people. I'm like, okay, I'm a retired teacher. What am I doing here? But
well, they gotta get people out to get those signatures.
well, this is true. We have a lot of people in this room that are very big on working for initiative petition drives and so forth. Finding, carrying clipboards, and approaching strangers. Yeah. Do we have any questions from the floor? If you'd like to, why don't we just? Oh, here's one thing. I don't know. Is that operational?
I wonder if you have had any thoughts or have you can approach the medical community, because I know that certainly the doctors that I know feel that this is a health issue that we begin with here, that we have an epidemic of violence. And I was really surprised and pleased that when I went in for my annual Medicare wellness check, among the many questions they asked me, they asked if to have a gun in the house, which I was really impressed by. But I would think that they would be really important allies for all of these efforts we're talking about.
Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Specifically? Okay, I'm sorry.
I thought I said whether any of you have approached by or have tried to build, partnerships with the medical community.
Sure, yes, I would definitely consider them an ally. Unfortunately, a lot of the partnerships are through St. Rose Children's Hospital and Cardinal Wood, because so many of the victims are still children, even if they're 18 years old, they're still children being seen at those children's hospitals. I know Children's Hospital through BJC has done a lot with gun locks, and I don't remember the exact percentage, Kathy, I don't know if you do, but I know that they have seen remarkable success in just handing out safety locks, gun safety locks. So again, wonderful allies, but I think that they're probably in some ways in the same position that we are. It's not intervention, they're trying with prevention, but they are seeing it just as bad as we are, and that it's really going to take legislative fix to address the real issue.
Some of you may remember Representative Susie Shear. She sponsored a gun locks bill year after year after year, and I think Dr. Simons and some other pediatricians went down and testified it was a blowout.
Does that?
Not
Yeah.
There are at a state level, or even a local level, but if they, for example, came out publicly as sponsors of, the Sensible series, or
I think they're natural allies when somebody starts organizing a campaign, because although I don't know that there's gonna be the money to do the reproductive rights thing this year, because it got late and it got expensive, but, there's a group that was formed because quite a few doctors, nurses and others on called healthcare professionals for reproductive rights. I think you have to set up something very specifically and get people engaged in that, because they're very good at speaking to the issues that are within their expertise, and this certainly is one. The ones that seen gun violence firsthand that we talk about. Right.
There are groups nationwide. Anybody know the group March 4th? They're specifically, I believe, emergency room physicians who see firsthand efforts to do the results of gun violence. I think there were like based in the Chicago area after that parade shooting. That's true. There's not enough of them. Any other questions? Oh, Mary?
Thank you. My question is regarding the Second Amendment Preservation Act. So this was a bill that was passed in Missouri by Missouri legislature a couple of years ago, which nullified federal gun laws in our state. Also charges any police that try to enforce federal gun laws. It makes them subject to a $58,000 fine. So my question is, I know the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear it. So is it still subject to more litigation? I lost track of where that is.
It was struck down by the judge in Kansas City, and I think his decision was upheld. I mean, that was just blatantly unconstitutional, because the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution says that federal law, assuming it's properly accepted, is superior to state law. And by the way, one of the ballot items that Ashcroft came up with in the group that was that one of them said, we didn't even mention this proposition itself, never even mentioned Second Amendment protection. But they said in the ballot title that it would repeal the Second Amendment protection. Well, the Second Amendment Protection Act, nobody knows what the hell it is. But Second Amendment Protection Act, they're going to repeal that? Oh, that sounds terrible. If you're, like first thing, people are that done. So it was totally off point. And so, yeah, we have that.
So since the lower court invalidated that law,
Right.
and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to weigh in on it, is it done or is
It's
it
done.
It's done. Okay.
It can't be forced. You know, the other allies we have are police officers, because police officers are at risk. And when you drive down the highway and you see a sign dedicating that portion of the highway to Sergeant so and so, chances are that guy probably got shot when he pulled somebody over for a traffic offense and got killed. The other part of it is that when you don't have any registration or any background check or licensing, you can have three knuckleheads in the car and a gun sitting on the console. Two of the knuckleheads have felony records, so they can't be possessors of it under federal law. And the third knucklehead said, well, that's mine. It doesn't matter if he's 13 years old, as long as he's not driving a car. But after all, you have to have a license to drive a car. So the cars are fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask for clarification on SAPA also. Yeah.
There are parts of the SAPA that are still in effect. That was the most egregious one.
Why?
I don't remember.
Okay, all right.
Not all the guns you want.
You went, oh, yeah. Oh, step forward, please.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I heard you, Jessica, at the summit, the Archdiocesan Summit, and to the lady who asked about healthcare, Dr. Garza actually spoke very movingly and powerfully at the summit about, seeing it very much as a public health problem. So, yes, natural allies. I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, I'm hearing about Sensible Missouri. I'm hearing about the work that's going on through the task force. I've been part of some of the months demand action work. I'm wondering who's coordinating all of this. If anyone's coordinating all of this, that's one question. And then the second one is that I'm hearing legislators in Missouri aren't the ones to go to because so very many of them are not, or will quietly say, listen, I hear what you're saying and I'd like to do it. I have to check with the NRA first. Literally, I was told that by a couple of legislators. But then I hear, Jessica, this legislation that you are pushing for and that others are pushing for, and I'm wondering how those of us out here can support it. And what's realistic? Yeah, who to go to, what to say.
We joke now when we go to Jeff City that we're gonna make like our gun violence bingo cards because we hear the same things all the time, right? So that's okay, because the more we hear it, then the better we can enhance our strategy the next time we go back. So I'm gonna go in. It may be, I understand people saying it's not worth it in Missouri, the legislators are never gonna change. I don't care, I'm still doing it. Like, I'm still going to Jeff City every chance I get and bringing the stories that I see every day. And I walk through those doors and I, pump myself up and say, they work for me. They work for me. At the very least, they're gonna listen. They can roll their eyes. They don't have to take the material. What we keep hearing is love what you do, love what St. Martha's does, but you just don't understand what a heavy lift this is in Missouri. They do understand what a heavy lift it is. I am willing to roll up my sleeves and help. So let's stop, right? Like stop with that. I think you make a really good point that there is not one point of contact for coordination. So, we are always looking at what is Catholic Charities priority, what is Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence priority, right? And trying to connect all those people because there is definitely power in numbers. I think that's why we started looking at the legislation the way we did, about, states that look just like Missouri already doing this. We're not asking anyone in the state of Missouri to be like the champion and do something huge. We're just asking for the most basic common sense that's already happening. Yeah. Like Kentucky. I know, I keep thinking like it's very strong.
The reason they call it representative, because they are.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, like, the question is, like, will there be like a lobby day on gun issues, all around, enacting?
I do know, Mom's demand action program has something coming in February.
There will be a lobby day, the date's not been set.
Okay,
It'll be February. Are you on Facebook?
no, I'm still in the dark ages, so. I never tell us. Okay. You do, okay, you'll get.
Mary would be the one. That's a lot of that stuff. I see it's my words. Go with my purpose. Any other questions? I would like, on behalf of Women's Voices, I would like to thank you very much for both spending your evening with us and offering us some information and hopefully some change coming soon. I'm curious to see what 2026 will bring with that initiative, the petition process, and going forward to not have 14-year-olds walk the streets of St. Louis with firearms. And